In 1960, when Grandma cooked Christmas dinner without ever looking at a recipe card, 50 secret recipes lived only in the minds and hands of grandparents. These weren't just cooking methods, they were edible memories, tasting, and years of practice. Today, they're vanishing because we stopped watching and started Googling. We're racing to capture all 50 before the last grandparents who knew them die and take the secrets to their graves. Share this with the one person you wish could sit with you in the kitchen, uncovering these secret Christmas recipes together. Walk into Grandma's kitchen on Christmas morning 1955 when she's making gravy without measuring a single thing, just listening to the pan and watching the color change. The secret nobody wrote down was this: gravy tells you when it's ready through sound. She'd sprinkle flour into the hot drippings, and the sizzle would be loud and angry at first. As she stirred, the sound would change, getting quieter, deeper, turning from a sharp sizzle to a gentle bubbling. When the sound dropped to a low, steady murmur and the flour smelled nutty instead of raw, that's when she'd add the liquid. She never measured the flour. She never timed it. She just listened and knew. "The pan talks to you if you pay attention," she'd say. Modern cooks follow recipes with exact measurements and still get lumpy gravy because they never learned to listen. The sound was the secret, and nobody thought to write that down. Step back to 1948, when Grandma made biscuits every Christmas morning without ever measuring the flour or buttermilk, just going by how the dough felt in her hands. The secret was texture. The dough had to feel like a baby's skin, soft but not sticky, smooth but not dry. She'd add flour until it stopped sticking to her fingers, then she'd stop immediately. Most people add too much flour because they're scared of sticky dough, and that's why their biscuits turn out hard as hockey pucks. Grandma knew that slightly sticky dough makes tender biscuits. She'd pat it down gently, never roll it hard, and cut them with an old biscuit cutter that had belonged to her mother. The biscuits would come out of the oven tall and fluffy, with layers you could pull apart. "Your hands know more than any measuring cup," she'd say. That knowledge lived in her fingertips, and she never thought to write it down, because how do you write down what something should feel like? Picture Christmas Eve, 1952, when Grandma would make 6 pies for Christmas dinner, and every crust was perfect without once measuring the flour, lard, or water. The secret was the 3-finger pinch. She'd grab lard with 3 fingers, work it into the flour until it looked like coarse crumbs, then add ice water 1 tablespoon at a time until the dough barely came together. But here's what she never wrote down. The dough should look shaggy and dry, like it won't possibly hold together, right up until the moment you press it into a ball. If it looks smooth and moist, you've already added too much water and the crust will be tough. She'd mix it just until it held, wrap it in a towel, and let it rest in the icebox for an hour. When she rolled it out, the crust would be flaky and tender, melting on your tongue. She learned this from her mother, who learned it from her mother, and nobody ever wrote down how shaggy dough should look or when to stop adding water. Go back to 1945 when Grandma made Christmas candy without owning a candy thermometer, testing the sugar syrup by dropping it into cold water and feeling it with her fingers, or sometimes just flicking a drop onto her inner wrist. The secret was knowing what each temperature felt like on your skin. Soft ball stage felt warm, but not burning. Hard ball stage felt hot and would sting slightly. Hard crack stage would burn if you weren't quick. She'd been making candy for so long that her wrist was her thermometer, more accurate than any tool you could buy. "Sugar tells you what it's ready for," she'd say. Walk into the warm kitchen on Christmas morning 1958, when Grandma is checking her bread dough by pressing 2 fingers into it, watching how fast it springs back, nodding with satisfaction, even though she hasn't used a timer or checked a clock once. The secret nobody wrote down was this: risen dough feels alive under your fingers. When you press it gently and it springs back quickly, it's not ready yet. When you press it and it springs back slowly, leaving a slight dent. That's when it's perfect. When you press it and the dent stays completely, you've waited too long and the bread will taste yeasty and sour. Grandma could tell the difference between those 3 stages with one touch. She'd let the dough rise near the warm stove, covered with a towel, checking it every so often with her fingers. The bread would come out perfect, soft inside, crusty outside, with that yeasty smell that meant Christmas morning. "Your fingers know when dough is happy," she'd say, and hers always did. 5 secrets revealed, 45 mysteries remain. These weren't in any cookbook. They lived in our grandparents' hands, in the way they could tell when dough felt right, when sugar reached the perfect temperature just by looking, when flavors balanced without measuring a single thing. Step back to Christmas 1950, when Grandma is mashing potatoes and adding butter and milk, but she's watching the color change rather than measuring anything, stopping at the exact moment when the potatoes turn from white to cream-colored. The secret was knowing that the right amount of butter turns potatoes a specific shade of pale yellow cream, and any more would make them greasy. Any less would make them dry. She'd add milk slowly, watching the potatoes lighten in color, stopping when they looked like clouds, with the faintest hint of butter yellow running through them. "Potatoes tell you by their color when they're happy," she'd say, beating them with her hand masher until they were smooth but not gummy. The finished potatoes would be fluffy and rich, holding their shape on the plate, but melting on your tongue. She never measured the butter or milk. She just watched the color change and knew when to stop. That knowledge came from making potatoes twice a week for 40 years, and she never thought to write it down because how do you describe the exact shade of cream-colored perfection? Picture Christmas afternoon, 1953, when Grandma would put the roast in the oven and never set a timer, just walking past the kitchen every so often and sniffing the air, somehow knowing exactly when it was done, without opening the oven door even once. The secret was the smell progression. First the roast would smell raw and bloody. Then it would start smelling like cooked meat. Then it would develop that deep, rich, brown smell that meant the outside was getting crusty. When the smell shifted from just cooked to caramelized and perfect, that's when she'd check it. She'd open the oven, press the roast with her finger, and if it felt right, firm, but with a little give, she'd pull it out. The roast would be perfect every time, medium rare in the center, crusty and dark on the outside. "Your nose knows before your eyes do," she'd say, and her nose had been trained by decades of Christmas dinners to recognize the exact smell of doneness that no timer could ever measure. Go back to 1947, when Grandma would make Christmas soup and add salt, not by measuring but by tasting, comparing what she tasted now to the memory of how the soup should taste, adding pinches until the two matched perfectly. The secret nobody wrote down was this: every dish has a flavor memory, and your job as a cook is to match what you're making to what you remember it should be. She'd taste the soup, close her eyes for a second like she was consulting some internal reference book, then add another pinch of salt, taste again, another pinch. Suddenly she'd nod and put the salt away, and when you tasted it, the soup would be perfectly seasoned, not too salty, not too bland, just right. "You've got to remember what right tastes like," she'd say. She carried 50 years of right flavors in her memory, and she could season anything perfectly by comparing the present to the past. Nobody can write that down. You have to build the memory yourself through years of tasting and paying attention. Walk into 1956, when Grandma would test her Christmas cake not just by inserting a toothpick, but by how the toothpick felt as it went in and came out. The resistance, the wobble, the way it moved through the batter. The secret was understanding that toothpick testing isn't just about whether crumbs stick to it. It's about how the toothpick moves. If it slides in with no resistance, the cake is too wet. If it goes in hard and comes out completely clean, the cake is overdone. The perfect cake has just a tiny bit of resistance going in, and comes out with 1 or 2 moist crumbs. Not wet batter, just moist crumbs. Grandma could tell all of this by the feel in her hand as she inserted the toothpick. She'd pull it out, look at it for half a second, and announce, 5 more minutes. Or, perfect, take it out now. Her cakes were always moist and tender, never dry, never underbaked. The toothpick talks to your hand before your eyes see anything, she'd say, and her hands had learned that language over decades of baking. Step back to Christmas, 1951, before electric mixers were common, when Grandma would whip cream by hand with a whisk, and she knew it was done not by looking at it, but by feeling when her wrist got tired in a specific way. The secret nobody wrote down was this: cream goes through stages as you whip it, and each stage requires different effort. At first it's easy. The whisk moves through liquid cream with no resistance. Then it gets slightly harder as the cream thickens. Then suddenly there's this moment where your wrist feels like it's hitting resistance, like the cream is pushing back. And that's when you're close. You whip for exactly 30 more seconds after that feeling hits, and the cream will be perfect. Soft peaks that hold their shape, but aren't grainy or starting to turn to butter. Grandma could feel that resistance point every single time. Your wrist knows when cream is ready to stop, she'd say, shaking out her tired arm. Modern people use mixers and sometimes over-whip because the machine doesn't feel anything. Grandma's wrist was her timer and her guide. Stop right there. You're starting to see it, aren't you? These aren't recipes. They're senses trained over decades until hands and noses and ears could do what no measuring cup can do. The next 40 secrets get even more specific. If this brought back memories, like the video and subscribe, so we can keep bringing forgotten holiday traditions back to life. Picture 1954, when Grandma would proof yeast by mixing it with warm water and sugar, then putting her nose near the bowl and smelling it to know if the yeast was alive and active. The secret was knowing what good yeast smells like versus dead yeast. Good yeast smells sweet and slightly beery, alive and fizzy. Dead yeast smells like nothing, or sometimes slightly sour. She'd mix the yeast, wait 5 minutes, and take 1 deep smell. If the smell was right, she'd continue with the recipe. If the smell was wrong or missing, she'd throw it out and start over. Yeast tells you if it's alive by how it smells, she'd say. She never waited for it to foam up like recipes say. She just smelled it and knew. Her Christmas rolls were always perfect, risen high and fluffy, because she never used dead yeast. She could smell the difference in 5 seconds, a skill she'd developed over 40 years of baking bread twice a week. Nobody wrote down what a live yeast smells like. You had to learn it by smelling it hundreds of times. Walk into Christmas morning 1949 when Grandma is making butter sauce for the vegetables, and she's listening to the butter melt in the pan, waiting for a specific sound that tells her it's ready for the next ingredient. The secret nobody wrote down was this: butter goes through sound stages as it heats. First, it's silent as it melts. Then it starts to sizzle quietly. Then the sizzle gets louder and more active as the water content cooks out. When the sizzle suddenly calms down and deepens into a steady, gentle sound, and you can smell the butter turning nutty, that's when it's ready. That's browned butter, perfect for sauces. Add anything before that sound change, and you'll have raw butter flavor. Wait too long after it, and you'll have burned butter. Grandma knew that sound change by heart. She'd stand at the stove, listening, and at the exact right moment she'd add the sage or garlic or whatever the recipe needed. "Listen to the butter sing," she'd say. "It'll tell you when it's ready." Her ears were trained to hear what her eyes couldn't see. Step back to 1957, when Grandma would make Christmas cookie dough and test whether it was ready not by measuring or timing, but by rolling a small piece between her palms into a ball and seeing if it held together without cracking or sticking. The secret was understanding that perfect cookie dough has a specific consistency. If you roll it and it crumbles or cracks, it needs more liquid or fat. If you roll it and it sticks to your hands, it needs more flour or time to chill, and it forms a smooth ball that holds together but doesn't stick to your palms. It's perfect. Grandma would test the dough this way before she ever started cutting cookies. If it failed the roll test, she'd adjust a tablespoon more milk, or a handful more flour, or 30 more minutes in the icebox. The dough tells you what it needs when you try to roll it, she'd say. Her cookies always had perfect texture, crispy edges, soft centers, because the dough was always the right consistency before she ever started baking. Go back to Christmas 1946, when Grandma would make cranberry jam for Christmas dinner, cooking it on the stove without a thermometer, testing it by dipping a cold metal spoon into the jam and watching how it dripped off. The secret nobody wrote down was the sheet test. When jam is done cooking, it doesn't drip off the spoon in separate drops anymore. Instead, it sheets off in a solid curtain, two streams joining together and sliding off the edge of the spoon as one piece. Grandma would keep a metal spoon in a glass of ice water, and every few minutes she'd dip it in the jam, pull it out, and watch how the jam fell. The moment it sheeted instead of dripped, she'd pull the pot off the heat. Her jam was always perfect, thick enough to spread. Not so thick it was gummy, just right. The jam shows you when it's ready to set, she'd say. She learned this from her mother, who learned it from her mother, and nobody ever wrote down what sheeting looks like because you had to see it to understand it. Picture 1959, when Grandma would test the Christmas roast by pressing it with her finger and comparing how it felt to different parts of her hand. The soft part of her palm meant rare. The base of her thumb meant medium. The firm part near her wrist meant well done. The secret was knowing that meat firmness matches hand firmness at different levels of cooking. Raw meat feels like the soft spot between your thumb and palm when your hand is relaxed. Medium rare feels like that same spot when you touch your thumb to your pointer finger. Medium feels like it when you touch your thumb to your middle finger. Well done feels like it when you touch thumb to pinky. Firm and resistant, Grandma would press the roast, then press her hand in the right position and know instantly how done the meat was. Your hand is the only thermometer you need, she'd say. She never cut into the meat to check, never used a thermometer, just pressed and compared. The roast would come out exactly how everyone wanted it, medium rare in the center, more done at the edges, because her fingers knew meat better than any tool could. 15 secrets uncovered, 35 still hidden. Our grandparents never wrote these down because they learned them the same way, by standing on wooden stools, watching flour-dusted hands move with confidence, absorbing knowledge that couldn't fit on recipe cards, no matter how carefully you tried to capture it. Walk into 1948, when Grandma would test eggs for Christmas baking by putting them in a bowl of water and watching what they did. Fresh eggs sink and lay flat. Older eggs stand on end. Bad eggs float. The secret nobody wrote down in detail was understanding the in-between stages. An egg that sinks but tilts slightly is about a week old, fine for baking. An egg that stands straight up on the bottom is about 3 weeks old, still safe, but better used for hard boiling than cakes. An egg that floats even a little bit is bad and should be thrown out immediately. Grandma could look at the angle of an egg under water and tell you exactly how old it was and what it should be used for. She never wrote dates on eggs, never worried about expiration. She just tested them in water and knew. Step back to 1955, when Grandma would make Christmas noodles from scratch and test if they were done by throwing one against the kitchen wall. If it stuck, it was done. If it slid down, it needed more time. The secret nobody wrote down was that this actually works because properly cooked pasta has just enough starch on the surface to be sticky when hot. Undercooked pasta is too hard and slides right off. Overcooked pasta is too soft and falls off in a sad clump. Perfect pasta sticks to the wall for a few seconds before slowly sliding down. Grandma would fish out one noodle with a fork, flick it at the wall above the stove, and watch what it did. "The wall doesn't lie about pasta," she'd say, and she was right. We kids thought it was hilarious and would beg her to do it. She'd pretend it was just for fun, but really she was testing, teaching us without teaching, showing us that cooking has playful ways to know when things are done. The noodles were always perfect, tender, but still with a little bite, never mushy. Go back to Christmas, 1952, when Grandma made caramel sauce and judged when it was done not by temperature but by holding the pan up to the light from the window and looking at the color through the thickness of the syrup. The secret was understanding that caramel color looks different depending on how you view it. Looking down into the pan, it looks darker than it really is. Holding it up to light shows you the true color. She'd cook the sugar, swirling the pan gently, and when she thought it was close, she'd lift the pan and look at the light shining through. When the color was deep amber, like dark honey or whiskey, she'd pull it off the heat immediately. "Light tells you the truth about caramel," she'd say. Her caramel was always perfect, sweet and slightly bitter, never burned, never too pale. She knew that 5 seconds separated perfect from ruined, and looking at the color by light gave her those 5 seconds of warning. Nobody wrote down that you should hold caramel up to light, but that one trick saved every batch she ever made. Picture 1950, when Grandma would let her Christmas bread rise and check if it had doubled by pressing her finger into the dough and measuring how deep it went compared to how high the dough had risen. The secret nobody wrote down was this: dough should rise to exactly twice its original height, and you can measure that with your finger. She'd press her finger gently into the risen dough until she felt the bottom of the bowl, remembering how deep that was. Then she'd look at how high the dough had risen above the rim. If the height matched the depth, it had doubled perfectly. "Your finger knows what doubled means," she'd say. She never eyeballed it, never guessed. She measured with her finger every single time. The bread would rise perfectly, never overproofed and sour, never underproofed and dense. This was geometry done by touch, mathematics done by instinct, and she did it so naturally she didn't even realize she was measuring. She just knew that her finger could tell her what doubled meant, and doubled was always right. Walk into 1958, when Grandma would check if her Christmas spices were still good by shaking the jar near her ear and listening to how the contents moved, then smelling them to confirm what her ears told her. The secret was knowing that fresh ground spices sound different than old ones. Fresh spices are slightly moist with essential oils, so they sound soft and muffled when you shake the jar, like sand that's slightly damp. Old spices are completely dry and sound sharp and rattly, like dried leaves. She'd shake each jar by her ear, listen carefully, then open and smell. If the smell was strong and immediate, the spices were good. If she had to stick her nose deep in the jar to smell anything, they were too old and needed replacing. "Spices talk before they smell," she'd say. Her Christmas cookies and pies always tasted intensely spiced and perfect because she only used fresh spices, and she knew which ones to replace before she ever started baking. The shake test was her quality control, and it saved her from wasting expensive ingredients on cookies that wouldn't taste right. 20 secrets down, and you're starting to understand how much knowledge lived in their hands, ears, noses, eyes, all the senses working together to cook without measuring, without timers, without any of the tools we think we need today. The next 30 secrets get even more specific. This is the knowledge we're losing. Keep going with me. Back to Christmas, 1953, when Grandma would test if her bread dough was kneaded enough by stretching a small piece between her fingers until it formed a thin membrane you could see light through. The secret nobody wrote down was the window pane test. Properly kneaded dough has developed enough gluten that you can stretch it thin without it tearing, and when you hold it up to the light, it looks like a translucent window. Under-kneaded dough tears immediately when you try to stretch it. Over-kneaded dough feels tough and springs back too hard. Perfect dough stretches smoothly into a thin sheet that holds together. Go back to 1947, when Grandma made Christmas candy and tested the sugar syrup by lifting a spoon from the pot and watching how the syrup dripped off in the cold air. Thread stage made thin threads, soft ball made thick drops, hard crack made brittle sheets. The secret was reading the syrup behavior in the split second between spoon and pot. She'd dip a metal spoon into the boiling syrup, lift it high, and watch carefully. If the syrup dripped off in separate drops, it wasn't ready. If it formed a thin thread between spoon and pot that broke easily, she was getting close. If the thread held strong for 2 inches before breaking, she'd reached thread stage, perfect for candy that needed to hold shape but stay slightly soft. "The syrup writes its own instructions in the air," she'd say. She never owned a candy thermometer until someone gave her one in 1965, and she never used it. Her eyes had been trained for decades to read syrup behavior, and her eyes were more accurate than any tool. Picture 1956, when Grandma could smell when something in the oven was 30 seconds away from burning and would rush to pull it out at the exact right moment, saving dozens of batches of cookies from disaster. The secret nobody wrote down was learning to recognize the smell progression from toasting to almost burning to burning. Toasting smells sweet and pleasant. Burning smells acrid and wrong. But almost burning has a specific smell. The sweetness gets sharper, takes on a slight edge, develops a faint bitterness underneath. Grandma knew that smell so well she could be in the next room, catch a whiff, and call out, "Check the oven!" Her timing was perfect even without timers because her nose was calibrated by 50 years of baking. "Your nose knows before the smoke alarm does," she'd say. She saved countless pies, cakes, and cookies by smelling that critical moment right before disaster. You can't write down what almost burning smells like. You have to burn enough things to recognize the moment before it happens, and then you never forget it. Walk into 1951, when Grandma would whip egg whites or cream and test if they were ready not by looking at peaks, but by tilting the bowl completely upside down over her head. If nothing fell out, they were done. The secret was understanding that properly whipped whites or cream defy gravity completely. Soft peaks will slide and fall if you turn the bowl over. Stiff peaks stay put, clinging to the bowl no matter what angle you hold it. Grandma would whip and whip, then, without hesitation, turn the bowl upside down above her head. If the contents stayed in place, she'd smile and continue with the recipe. If anything started to slide, she'd flip it back quickly and keep whipping. "When it sticks upside down, it'll hold up in the oven," she'd say. Her angel food cakes and meringues were always perfect because the eggs were always whipped to exactly the right stage. The upside-down test was foolproof, even though it looked dangerous. She never once dropped a bowl of egg whites on her head because she knew exactly when they were ready. 25 secrets recovered, 25 slipping away. We're racing against time because the last people who knew these recipes by heart are leaving us, taking with them the little adjustments they made without thinking, the tricks they'd learned from their own grandmothers, the wisdom that only comes from making something 100 times. Step back to Christmas, 1954, when Grandma would pull bread from the oven based not on time, but on crust color. comparing what she saw to the memory of thousands of loaves she'd baked before. The secret was having a reference library in her mind of what perfect bread should look like. Deep golden brown, not pale yellow, not dark mahogany, exactly in between. She'd open the oven, look at the loaf, and know instantly if it needed 2 more minutes or was done now or should have come out a minute ago. Bread shows you when it's happy with color, she'd say. Her bread was always perfectly baked, crusty outside, soft inside, golden brown all over. She never relied on timers because ovens varied, weather affected baking time, the size of the loaf mattered. But the right color was always the right color, and her eyes knew that color the way musicians know the right pitch. That visual memory couldn't be written down or taught quickly. You had to bake enough loaves to burn that color into your brain permanently. Go back to 1949 when Grandma would test if her bread dough was the right temperature for rising by pressing her cheek against the bowl. If it felt baby bottle warm, exactly the temperature you'd want milk for an infant, the dough was perfect for rising. The secret nobody wrote down was that your cheek is more sensitive to temperature than your hands, which are used to hot and cold. Your cheek knows body temperature perfectly because it's always been that temperature. Grandma would mix the dough, then press the bowl against her cheek for just a second. If it felt too cool, she'd set it near the warm stove. If it felt too warm, she'd move it away. "Your face knows what warm means better than your hands do," she'd say. The dough would rise perfectly every time because the temperature was always exactly right. Warm enough to activate the yeast, not so hot it would kill it. That cheek test was more accurate than any thermometer because her skin had been calibrated by human body temperature for 70 years. Picture 1958, when Grandma would know her Christmas stew was done not by time, but by dipping a wooden spoon in and seeing if the liquid coated the back of the spoon in a thin, even layer that didn't immediately drip off. The secret was understanding that as stew cooks, the starches from potatoes and the collagen from meat break down and thicken the liquid naturally. When the stew is done, the broth should coat a spoon the same way properly thickened gravy does. She'd stir the stew, pull out the spoon, run her finger across the back. If the line stayed clear and the coating didn't run back together, the stew was perfect. "The spoon tells you when everything has given what it can give," she'd say. Her stews were always rich and thick, never watery, never gummy, just right. She never added flour or cornstarch to thicken because she cooked it long enough for it to thicken itself, and the spoon test told her exactly when that had happened. Walk into Christmas, 1952, when Grandma would make pie dough in the dark if she had to, because her hands knew what the texture should be at every stage. Dry and crumbly after cutting in the fat, shaggy, and barely holding together after adding water, smooth and cool after resting. The secret nobody wrote down was that perfect dough has a specific texture at each step, and your hands can recognize it without your eyes helping. She'd work the dough with her fingertips, feeling for the moment when fat and flour became one thing with no dry flour left, but no greasiness either. "Your fingers read dough like your eyes read words," she'd say. She could make perfect pie crust in dim light on early Christmas mornings because her hands had made that dough so many times they knew the journey from flour to pastry by touch alone. That knowledge lived in her fingertips. The pressure needed, the texture changes, the exact moment to stop working it. You can't write down what properly textured dough feels like. You have to touch it 1,000 times until your hands remember forever. Step back to 1950, when Grandma would scald milk for Christmas pudding by watching for the exact moment when the first tiny bubbles appeared around the edge of the pan, pulling it off the heat before it boiled over. The secret was understanding that scalded milk shouldn't boil. It should heat to just below boiling. which happens right when you see those first warning bubbles. She'd heat the milk on medium, watching it constantly, never walking away. The milk would be still and quiet. Then suddenly tiny bubbles would form around the edges like a ring. The instant she saw them, off the heat it came. "Milk warns you once before it makes a mess," she'd say. Her puddings and custards were always smooth and perfect because the milk was properly scalded, hot enough to cook the eggs without scrambling them. Most people boil milk or don't heat it enough. Grandma watched for that first bubble ring and knew that was the exact right moment. That visual cue saved countless pots from boiling over and countless custards from being lumpy. Go back to Christmas 1955, when Grandma would test her cranberry jam by putting a spoonful on a cold plate, waiting a few seconds, then pushing it with her finger. If the surface wrinkled and held the wrinkle, the jam was ready to set. The secret nobody wrote down in detail was what that wrinkle should look like. Too loose and the wrinkle disappears immediately. Keep cooking just right, and the wrinkle holds for a second before slowly smoothing. Perfect. Too stiff and the wrinkle stays permanent and the jam is stiff as rubber. Overcooked. Grandma kept a plate in the icebox just for jam testing. Every 5 minutes she'd drop a spoonful on the cold plate, wait 10 seconds, push it with her finger, and read what the wrinkle told her. "The jam writes its own recipe with wrinkles," she'd say. Her jam was always spreadable and perfect, never too runny, never too stiff, because she read the wrinkles correctly every single time. That test came from her grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother, and nobody ever wrote down the subtle differences between wrinkle stages. 30 secrets in, and you're seeing the pattern. Every sense was a tool. Every small sign was information. The next 20 secrets are even more specific, even more impossible to learn from a book. This is what we lost when we stopped paying attention. Stay with me. Picture 1957, when Grandma would frost Christmas cakes and know the frosting was the right consistency by the sound the knife made as it spread. A smooth, quiet swish meant perfect. A dragging scratch meant too stiff. A wet slosh meant too thin. The secret nobody wrote down was listening to the knife. She'd make butter frosting, and if it needed adjusting, her ears would tell her before her eyes did. Too stiff frosting makes a scraping sound as you spread it. Too thin frosting makes almost no sound because it's sliding like water. Perfect frosting makes a soft, smooth sound, like a whisper as the knife glides across the cake. "Listen to what the knife is telling you about the frosting," she'd say. She'd adjust by beating it more to make it fluffier, or adding more sugar to thicken it, or a few drops of milk to thin it. Her cakes were always beautifully frosted, smooth and even, because the frosting was always the perfect consistency, and her ears knew that before her eyes could see it. Walk into Christmas, 1953, when Grandma would heat her cast-iron skillet for searing meat and know it was hot enough not by time or temperature, but by watching how smoke curled off the empty pan. The secret was understanding smoke behavior at different temperatures. Not hot enough and there's no smoke. Too hot, and smoke pours out in thick clouds. Perfect temperature sends up thin wisps that curl and disappear quickly. She'd heat the pan, add just a drop of oil, and watch. When thin smoke wisps appeared and curled gracefully before vanishing, she'd add the meat. Step back to 1948, when Grandma would make Christmas noodles and know the dough was kneaded enough when the surface went from looking dull and rough to smooth and slightly shiny, like satin fabric. The secret nobody wrote down was what that shine meant. It meant the gluten had developed fully, the dough had become elastic and unified, and it was ready to rest before rolling. She'd knead, and suddenly the dough would change under her hands, going from matte to glossy. "The dough tells you it's ready by catching the light," she'd say. She'd press it one more time, see her handprint shine on the surface, and know it was perfect. The noodles would be tender and silky, never tough, never falling apart. Go back to Christmas, 1951, when Grandma would test if bread was fully baked by pulling the loaf from the oven, flipping it over, and tapping the bottom with her knuckles. If it sounded hollow like a drum, it was done. If it sounded dull and solid, it needed more time. The secret was knowing that properly baked bread develops air pockets throughout, and those pockets create a hollow sound when you tap them. Underbaked bread is still dense inside and sounds thick and heavy. Overbaked bread sounds hollow but also feels too light because moisture has completely baked out. Perfect bread sounds hollow but still has weight in your hand. Bread talks when you knock on its door, she'd say, tapping the bottom of each loaf. Her Christmas bread was always perfectly baked, crusty outside, fluffy inside, fully cooked through, because her knuckles were trained to hear the difference between hollow and dull. That tap test came from Europe, passed down through generations, and nobody ever wrote down exactly what hollow sounds like versus not quite hollow. Picture 1959, when Grandma would cream butter and sugar for Christmas cookies, beating them together and watching for the moment when the mixture suddenly turned from yellow to pale ivory. That color change meant enough air had been incorporated and she could stop beating. The secret nobody wrote down was that color is the signal for proper creaming. When you start, butter and sugar look yellow and grainy. As you beat them, air gets incorporated and the mixture gets lighter in color and fluffier in texture. When it goes from yellow to almost white, pale as ivory, you've creamed it enough. Stop there. Beat more and you'll warm the butter too much, and cookies will spread too thin. The butter tells you when it's full of air by changing color, she'd say. Her cookies always had perfect texture, crispy edges, soft centers, because she creamed the butter exactly right every time. She'd beat it with her wooden spoon, watching the color lighten, and stop at the exact moment it reached pale ivory. That knowledge came from making cookies twice a week for 50 years, 35 secrets preserved, 15 fading fast. These final recipes are the ones our grandparents guarded most carefully, not because they were secret, but because they required understanding that couldn't be written down, instincts that developed over decades, and knowledge passed only to those who truly wanted to learn. Walk into 1954, when Grandma would test if vegetables were blanched enough by pulling one out, letting it cool for a second, then bending it. If it snapped cleanly with a crack sound, it was perfectly crisp tender. The secret was listening to vegetables talk. Undercooked vegetables bend without breaking and make no sound. Overcooked vegetables bend limply and make a soft, sad sound. Perfect vegetables snap cleanly in half with an audible crack. She'd blanch green beans or asparagus, pull out one piece with tongs, wave it in the air to cool it, and bend it near her ear. Crack. Perfect. Into the ice bath they'd go to stop cooking. Vegetables tell you their texture with sound before you taste them, she'd say. Her Christmas vegetables were always perfectly cooked, tender but still with bite, bright green, never mushy. The snap test told her everything she needed to know, and her ears had been trained by decades of cooking to recognize that exact crack sound that meant crisp, tender perfection. You can't write down what that sound sounds like. You have to hear it dozens of times to recognize it forever. Step back to Christmas, 1950, when Grandma would decide whether to make candy or meringue based on how the air felt on her skin that morning. If it felt damp and sticky, she'd skip anything that required sugar work because humid air ruins candy and meringue. The secret nobody wrote down was that your skin is a humidity sensor. On dry days, your skin feels normal and comfortable. On humid days, even before rain, your skin feels slightly clammy, and you notice it when you wash your hands or touch your face. Grandma would step outside first thing Christmas morning, feel the air on her skin, and know if it was a candy-making day or not. "Sugar knows what your skin knows about water in the air," she'd say. She'd adjust her baking plans based on that skin feeling. Go back to 1956, when Grandma would heat oil for frying Christmas cookies and test if it was ready by sticking the handle of a wooden spoon in the oil. If bubbles formed around the wood immediately, the oil was hot enough. The secret was reading the bubble behavior. No bubbles meant not hot enough. Wait longer. Tiny, fast bubbles all around the wood meant perfect. Start frying. Big, violent bubbles meant too hot. Turn down heat and wait. Her fried cookies were always perfect, golden and crispy, never greasy, never burned, because the oil temperature was always exactly right. She didn't need a thermometer. She just needed a wooden spoon handle and the knowledge, passed down from her grandmother, that wood and hot oil create bubbles that tell you everything you need to know about temperature. That test saved her from wasting oil and cookies by frying at the wrong temperature. Picture Christmas, 1952, when Grandma would make custard sauce and know it was thick enough by running her finger across the back of the wooden spoon. The secret was understanding that properly cooked custard coats a spoon in a thick layer that holds together. Too thin, and the line disappears immediately as liquid custard runs back. Perfect. And the line stays clear, maybe widening slightly, but not closing. Too thick, and the custard is starting to scramble. She'd stir the custard constantly, and every minute she'd lift the spoon, run her finger across it, and check the line. Her custards were always silky, smooth, never scrambled, perfectly thick. Walk into 1958, when Grandma would temper chocolate for Christmas candies and test if it was ready by dipping a knife in the chocolate, setting it aside for 2 minutes, then looking at how it dried. If it dried smooth and shiny with no streaks, the chocolate was properly tempered. The secret nobody wrote down was what those streaks meant. Streaky chocolate means the cocoa butter hasn't been properly aligned. It'll bloom and turn gray in a few days. Smooth, shiny chocolate with no streaks means perfect temper. It'll snap when you break it and stay shiny forever. She'd temper chocolate over a double boiler. 40 recipes in, and you've seen 40 different ways they used their bodies as tools. Their senses were so sharp. The last 10 secrets are the deepest ones. The ones that required a lifetime to learn. These are the recipes dying with them. 10 left. Step back to Christmas 1945, when Grandma kept a sourdough starter in a crock on the counter and knew when it was ready to use, not by time or by looking at it, but by how it smelled at different stages of fermentation. The secret nobody ever wrote down in detail was that sourdough goes through distinct smell stages as it ferments, and each smell tells you something specific about what's happening inside that crock, like fresh dough with just a hint of tang. That's the beginning, and it's not ready yet. As hours pass, it gets more sour, more complex, taking on layers of scent, still sweet underneath, but with increasing tang, a slight alcohol note appearing as the yeast becomes active. This is the middle stage, when the starter is waking up and beginning to work. Go back to Christmas 1951, when Grandma would put a covered pot on the stove and know exactly what was happening inside by listening to how the steam sounded as it escaped from under the lid. Different foods made different steam sounds at different stages of cooking. The secret nobody wrote down was this: steam talks. And if you learn its language, you can cook anything perfectly without ever lifting the lid and releasing heat. When she'd put a pot of vegetables onto steam, she'd listen carefully as the water heated. First, silence. Then, the water would start to simmer, and you'd hear gentle bubbling, but no steam yet. Then the steam would start escaping, a quiet, steady hiss that meant the water was boiling and steam was building. As the vegetables cooked, the steam sound would change. At first it was wet-sounding steam, almost gurgling, because the vegetables were releasing moisture and there was lots of water vapor. As they continued cooking and started to dry out slightly, the steam sound would become drier, more of a pure hiss without the wet gurgle underneath. When Grandma heard that sound change from wet to dry, she knew the vegetables were almost done. If she kept listening and the hiss started to become intermittent, hiss, pause, that meant the water was getting low and the vegetables were in danger of burning. Time to take the lid off and check. Walk into Christmas, 1955, when Grandma would make 3 different kinds of dough in one morning: pie crust, bread dough, and cookie dough, and she'd talk about them like they were people with personalities, saying this one was stubborn, that one was cooperative, this one needed encouragement. Secret nobody ever wrote down was that different doughs actually do have personalities based on their ingredients, and experienced bakers learn to read those personalities by touch and adjust their handling accordingly. Pie crust dough is shy and difficult. It doesn't want to be worked. Gets tough if you handle it too much, needs to be treated gently and left alone to rest. Pie crust dough is shy and difficult. It doesn't want to be worked. Gets tough if you handle it too much, needs to be treated gently and left alone to rest. Grandma would mix it just until it barely held together, then wrap it and refrigerate it, saying, "Pie dough needs time alone to think about what it wants to be." Bread dough is friendly and forgiving. It wants to be kneaded, responds well to attention, gets better the more you work with it. She'd knead bread dough for 10 minutes, and you could see her relaxing as she worked because bread dough gave feedback, becoming smoother and more elastic under her hands, rewarding effort with obvious improvement. "Bread dough wants to work with you," she'd say. "It appreciates your effort." Picture. Christmas 1958, when Grandma would go to the butcher and choose the Christmas roast by looking at how fat was distributed through the meat, not just how much fat, but the pattern of it, the quality of it, the way it looked against the red of the muscle. The secret nobody wrote down in detail was that marbling, the white streaks of fat running through meat, tells you everything about how the meat will cook and taste, but only if you know how to read it. She'd look at 3 different roasts, examining each one carefully, and she'd choose based on marbling pattern that most people couldn't even see. Good marbling isn't just about having fat present. It's about having the right kind of fat in the right places. She looked for fine marbling, thin streaks distributed evenly throughout the meat like a delicate web, not thick chunks of fat separated from the muscle. Fine marbling meant the fat would melt during cooking and baste the meat from the inside, keeping it moist and adding flavor. Thick, chunky fat meant you'd have chewy fat sections and dry meat sections in the same roast. She also looked at the color of the fat. It should be white or cream-colored, not yellow. Yellow fat meant old meat or poor diet in the animal. The red of the meat should be bright and clear, not dark or purplish, and the marbling should be consistent throughout the visible cut. If one end had marbling and the other end didn't, the roast would cook unevenly. "Meat tells you its whole story if you look carefully," she'd say. The butcher would try to sell her whatever roast he wanted to move, but Grandma would examine each one, and she'd choose the one with the finest, most evenly distributed marbling, regardless of what he recommended. Step back to Christmas, 1950, when Grandma would follow recipes that said things like a handful of flour, or a pinch of salt, or butter the size of a walnut, and she knew exactly what those meant because her hands were her measuring tools, calibrated by decades of cooking. The secret nobody wrote down was that hand measurements are actually consistent. Your handful is always roughly the same volume, your pinch is always roughly the same amount. And once you learn what your hand measurements mean in standard measurements, you can cook without measuring cups forever. Grandma's handful of flour was about 3/4 of a cup. Her pinch of salt was about 1/8 of a teaspoon. Her palm full of sugar was 1/2 a cup. She knew this not because she measured it scientifically, but because she'd used her hands for so long that they'd become reliable tools, A handful meant filling her cupped palm until it was full but not overflowing. A pinch meant what she could pick up between her thumb and first two fingers. A dash meant a quick shake over the pot, about 2 pinches. Go back to Christmas 1948, before accurate oven thermometers existed in most homes, when Grandma would test oven temperature by opening the door and holding her hand inside at different heights for a few seconds, reading the heat with her palm. The secret nobody wrote down in detail was that different positions in the oven have different temperatures, and your palm can learn to read those temperatures more accurately than early oven thermometers, which were often wrong by 50 degrees or more. She'd light the oven, let it heat for what she judged was enough time based on how much wood or coal she'd added, then open the door. Hand at the top of the oven, palm facing down. If she could hold it there for 3 seconds before jerking away, that was about 350 degrees. 2 seconds meant 400 degrees. 1 second meant 450 or higher. Hand at the middle of the oven, add about 20 seconds to those times. Hand at the bottom, add 40 seconds. Walk into Christmas morning, 1953, when Grandma would put her ear near the bowl of rising bread dough and listen for the tiny, crackling, popping sounds that meant yeast was actively working, eating sugar, producing gas bubbles that were stretching the gluten strands with thousands of microscopic pops. The secret nobody ever wrote down was that rising dough makes sound if you listen carefully enough, and those sounds tell you whether the yeast is healthy and active or weak and struggling. She'd mix the dough, set it near the warm stove to rise, cover it with a towel, and then every 30 minutes or so she'd lift the towel, put her ear close to the surface of the dough, not touching, just hovering an inch above, and listen. Step back to Christmas 1951, when Grandma would let bread dough rise and know exactly when it was ready, not by time or by how much it had expanded, but by how the smell changed as morning turned to afternoon, understanding that dough rising in morning light smells different than dough rising in afternoon warmth. The secret nobody wrote down was that yeast fermentation creates smell compounds that change throughout the day based on temperature, and experienced bakers learn to read those smell changes to judge rise time. Morning dough, rising in a cool kitchen with sun just coming through windows, smells mild and sweet, slightly yeasty but gentle. The fermentation is slow and controlled, and the smell reflects that. It's pleasant, not aggressive, like fresh flour with just a hint of wine underneath. Picture Christmas, 1959, when Grandma would look at raw cookie dough on the baking sheet and predict exactly how much each cookie would spread, whether they'd stay thick or flatten into discs, and she'd know this before the cookies went in the oven, just by observing how the raw dough sat on the pan. The secret nobody wrote down was that cookie dough behavior is predictable if you know what to look for. Dough that holds its shape firmly on the pan, sitting tall with defined edges, will spread minimally during baking. These become thick, cake-like cookies. Dough that starts to slump immediately after being placed on the pan, edges softening and spreading slightly even before heat, will spread extensively during baking. These become thin, crispy cookies. Dough that sits in between, holding its shape but not rigidly, will spread moderately and produce cookies with the perfect texture balance. Grandma would scoop cookie dough onto the pan, watch how it behaved in the 30 seconds after placement, and know exactly what kind of cookies she'd get. If she wanted thicker cookies but saw the dough starting to slump, she'd put the pan in the refrigerator for 10 minutes to firm up the butter before baking. If she wanted thinner cookies but saw the dough sitting too firm, she'd let it sit at room temperature until it softened slightly. "Cookie dough tells you what it's going to do before it does it," she'd say. Walk into Christmas, 1955, when Grandma would cook a full Christmas dinner, turkey, 3 side dishes, rolls, gravy, and dessert, timed so perfectly that everything finished at exactly the same moment, all hot, all ready, nothing overcooked or cold. And she did this without writing anything down, without timers, just by holding the entire cooking sequence in her mind and executing it with precision that would impress military planners. A secret nobody wrote down, because it was too complex to explain in words, was the mental skill of reverse timing and parallel processing. She'd start by deciding what time dinner would be served, say 2 p.m. Then she'd work backward. Turkey takes 3 hours and needs 30 minutes rest, so it goes in the oven at 10:30 a.m. and comes out at 1:30 p.m. Rolls take 20 minutes to bake and should be served hot, so they go in at 1:40 p.m. Mashed potatoes take 30 minutes start to finish and should be made last, so they stay hot. So start those at 1:30 p.m. while turkey rests. Green beans take 15 minutes. Start them at 1:45 p.m. Gravy uses turkey drippings and takes 10 minutes. Make it at 1:50 p.m. Everything finishes between 1:55 and 2, all hot, all perfect.